a big chunk of the population does not have much influence. I mean, it doesn't really matter who the elite is. I mean, it's a bad thing anyway, because democracy is about political equality, of course. When we discuss the elite...
But do you mean to say that the politicians, the result of this study that you're citing here is that the politicians, they go with what the rich people want
simply because they are, they need money to pursue their campaigns, and that's the case in the U.S.
This is the United States, of course.
In the
maybe it's a bit different in Europe.
Yeah, it's different in Europe, but similar studies in Germany have provided similar results. And
Welcome to Mind the Shift. My name is Anders Bolling. In the very first episode of this podcast, we had a conversation about democracy and how it's faring in the world. The take on the issue by my two guests then, Mikael Sandberg and Max Ronge, was that it might not be as bad in as bad a shape as many claim, and they based that on an enormous amount of regime data. Now, democracy entails a number of attributes, but it doesn't have one undisputed definition. So the conversation about its health is poised to continue, of course. My guest today is Folke Tersman. He is professor of practical philosophy at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, and he also holds a position at the Institute for Future Studies in Stockholm. Tersman just came out with a topical book that he co-wrote with philosopher Torbjörn Tännsjö. It's called People and Will, Folk och vilja in Swedish, with the subtitle A Defense of Democracy in Our Time. Welcome to the show, Folke.
Thank you very much.
You argue that we are in this book we are in a sort of interregnum. I don't know how you pronounce it in English, but interregnum between regimes, so to speak. So, which means that the old hasn't died, and the new can't yet be born. So, the question is, and your hope, as I understand it, is that this period will last for as short a period of time as possible. How would you describe this kind of limbo of our time? What is this interregnum thing?
Yes. So, I mean, in your first show, these persons kind of indicated that it is we're in a period where the picture of democracy and its successes is a bit mixed. And it's true that democracy has had a lot of success the last 3-4 decades. We have seen a great growth, and we can still see positive signs across the world, but we also see all these worries, right-wing populism, inequality, growing inequality, and so on and so forth. And what has taken place during these decades is, according to our analysis, that a lot of the power that national governments used to have has been transferred to other agents or actors in society. So in the 70s, even up until the 80s, national governments had a lot of influence over what happened in their countries, and they could promise their voters to do stuff, various things, and then actually do them. But then the economy has been, shall we say, liberated through globalization. And what that has meant, that has had enormous implications, of course, for life, for everybody. But one aspect of this process is that national government, the sphere of influence of national governments has become more limited.
Yeah.
And this is simply since multinational corporations can put a pressure on national governments and say, if you don't lower taxes, if you don't do so and so, then we might take our resources, take our plants, take our jobs, and move elsewhere where they have conditions that we find more viable or better. So national governments are today they are pressured today by this globalization process, which has undermined their ability to help people with their lives, basically, in their countries.
But has this happened now during the last few decades, or because if you go back even further, 100 years back, or when democracy started more or less in the 19th century and early 20th, would you say that governments had more agency then than they have today, or that companies had less agency at that time, or is this something that...
Well, everything was more local. Of course, we had globalization already in the 19th century.
For some people.
True. For some people, but a lot of what determined the lives of these people was determined by local factors, I would say, or local decisions made by politicians, but also corporations, of course. But I am mostly comparing with the situation a few decades ago, say in the 70s.
Like in 60s, 70s?
Something like that.
Okay.
And I would say the interregnum comes from the fact that while the economy has developed in this direction, the political sphere has not yet adapted. And what we are waiting for and proposing is that, the political sphere must adapt more quickly to this new situation to regain, shall we say, the agency of democracy in the world.
So the politicians have to catch up with
we have to catch up. We have to catch up as a society. We have to catch up.
Okay. So I'm going to come back to the question about we and they, because I think that's kind of interesting.
Okay.
Definition of who is we and who is we. Anyway, so this is as you are mentioning here. There's a change in the meaning that there has been a flight over to so-called populist parties, right-wing parties often, but often also in some countries left-wing populist parties, what we call populist parties, and also voter flight in general, that people don't vote as much as they did in some countries. Anyway, there have been some kinds of changes in that respect. And how much of that recent flight from the classic, let's say the classic left-right parties, is due to, and here I come to something that you haven't really touched upon as yet. We're talking about the polarization and social media's role in these things. How much of this flight that I'm talking about from the classic left-right parties is due to voters being manipulated by polarized media and populist leaders, and how much is due to the opposite, that there is some kind of political awakening maybe among people, that people are starting to think for themselves, if you see what I mean. Because sometimes people are talking about they're so scared that this is happening, but maybe what's happening is that people are actually not just voting as their parents did or their grandparents or their neighbors. They just think for themselves, and then it gets messy.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complex situation. I think manipulation and polarization via this new media plays some role in this development. I should also say, and what you're kind of indicating is that the internet has given us resources to pursue a more open discussion than before. I mean, more actors have gotten the opportunity to get involved, which I think is, on the whole, a good thing. There are bad things about this development, of course, also, and we have seen that in recent elections, for example, manipulation. But we think that these phenomena are a little bit more superficial than the more fundamental causes of the situation today. So it's true that people have turned to right-wing parties and also to left-wing parties, and sometimes people go from left-wing populist parties to right-wing populist parties, and perhaps the other way around. I think a lot of the people who voted for Trump in the 2016 election voted for Obama before. and what they have in common is not much, but they were both seen as outsiders. So I think that could be seen, and this is something we argue in the book, could be seen as a reaction towards the notion that it doesn't really, I mean, if we look at these more conventional political parties and conventional politicians, it doesn't really matter who we vote for. We still get the same result. And we're citing a study in the book which has surveyed a lot of political decisions in the United States. And the result was that, it doesn't really matter how the middle class votes. What determines the outcomes of these decision-making processes is basically what the elite believes or wants. So if the richest 5% say want something, then it's going to happen. If the elite says no, then it's not going to happen, independently of who is actually making the decision. If it's a Republican president or a Democrat president, or at other levels of government. So, and I think that has kind of led to the sense that the feeling that it doesn't really matter what we do, and which understandably I think leads to protest voting, or to you want to. Democracy is about being heard, basically, and to go to these extremes is a way to be heard. Yeah,
well, it's kind of understandable then, and maybe wise even from the voters to react in that way.
Exactly, and I think we shouldn't just look at manipulation, social media, or that people have suddenly become more stupid or whatever. We don't think that's the right way to approach this. The right way is to see it as a response to a real problem that we need to address.
And you reason a little bit, or quite a bit actually, in the book also around this issue of elite, as you were talking about, the elite and the rest. So who is the elite? I mean, you don't really answer that question in the book because I guess it's a very difficult question to answer.
No, I mean, there are lots of definitions, of course, and they can be suitable in different contexts. In this study that we are citing, they simply took the richest people. I mean, they didn't look at education level or whatever. And I guess, and you could use more other definitions, of course. And I think that's enough. I mean, to see that a big chunk of the population does not have much influence. I mean, it doesn't really matter who the elite is. I mean, it's a bad thing anyway, because democracy is about political equality, of course. When we discuss the elite...
But you mean to say that the politicians, the result of this study that you're citing here is that the politicians, they go with what the rich people want.
Simply because they are, they need money to pursue their campaigns, and that's the case in the U.S.
This is the United States, of course.
In the
maybe it's a bit different in Europe.
Yeah, it's different in Europe, but similar studies in Germany have provided similar results, and there we have other mechanisms. I mean, in Sweden we have elements of something called soft corruption. I mean, politicians go straight from having a top job in the government to the private sector and can bring all his or her networks and so on and so forth. So we have I mean, the situation probably is not as bad as in the US, I would say, but we have similar related mechanisms that produce similar results, I would say.
So when people see this, whatever the people is, I mean, maybe we should delve a little bit more deeper into that. Let's start in that end. Who is we and who is they?
Yeah, I mean... So
who is the people?
We are simply talking about citizens in
But
general.
I mean, rich people are citizens,
yeah,
politicians
of course,
are citizens.
So they should have a say. We're obviously Democrats here, and they should have a say. But the ideal of democracy is the ideal of political equality, of course. So we should at least approach a situation where in some sense each citizen has an equal chance of influencing the decision making, and that's what we see as a problem. Then we talk about the elite in another context, and maybe I should elaborate that a little bit when we are discussing the objections to democracy. So one very common objection to democracy is that a lot of people lack the type of education that is needed to reach good decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, we should limit their influence of politics. And that can be a very radical type of criticism, which we find, which we reject. I mean, saying that democracy might not be such a good idea after all. We disagree with that, obviously. But we think it is important. An important advantage of the representative system is that if we have representatives who devote some of their lives to political decision making, gathering of information, and so on and so forth, that inspires or constitutes a learning process that might address the problem of uninformed decisions without giving up on democracy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So when the people,
All of
again,
us.
the people, a majority of the voters see that this is the thing that you were talking about before is happening, that the politicians, they go with what the rich people say or want in any at any instant. I mean, regardless of what the kind of, if it's a left-wing party or right-wing party in charge, then they see this, and perhaps they see it more clearly now than they did 50 years ago or 60 years ago or 40 years ago, and they feel resentment towards that, and they think that no, this is not working. The politicians are just they're not doing what the majority of us want anyway. So what's the point of this? We need something different. Is that a bad thing to think when it's going that way?
No. I think it's right to respond to this lack of responsiveness from the that the political system has today. And we've cited another fact which I think is interesting, and that's in Sweden we have a quite a large voting turnout. People go and vote into parliament, and they have done for a long time.
It's about 80% or something.
Yeah, and it goes up and down a little bit, but it's pretty impressive, I think. But in some groups, the turnout has gone down for a long time, especially in these groups that are now voting for Sweden Democrats, for the kind of right-wing populist party in Sweden. And now voting in that group has also gone up. And I think that is a memento. That means something. And also illustrates, I think, a good thing about the Swedish system, namely that we have this proportional representation feature. So you can vote for a party which only gets, say, 5% of the vote, and you still get representation in parliament. Whereas in countries like the US and the UK, that's not the case. So big, minority views are never represented in these bodies.
Yeah.
So that is a good thing. Where I think Swedish type of democracy is more adaptive to this situation.
Parliamentarism. And what's happening now in Sweden, as you say, these, as if I understand you correctly, the groups that are sympathetic towards these right-wing populists, their voting turnout is
more than
increasing.
Yeah.
Which means that they have realized that these Sweden Democrats are something to. Is a force to be reckoned with.
Yes.
And maybe they will come to power someday. And in your book, you don't reason anything around what is good or what is bad about the politics in itself. Isn't that so? Because you're reasoning around democracy and the democratic system, and whether it's working or not, or whether it's actually representing what the people want or not. Not really if it's right or left or liberal or socialist or whatever.
No, exactly. We want a democracy without a prefix, we said. I mean, we're we're not in favor of liberal democracy and not of social democracy or socialist democracy or whatever. We are just for democracy. Yeah. And that's not based on some idea that democracy always leads to the morally best decision or whatever. That's not our argument. Our argument is that by and large, if you compare this system with other systems, I mean more authoritarian ones, this is better. Mm-hmm. That's our argument.
But you do reason a little bit around inequality, which is often something that people on the left wing do in the book. And you say in the book that there has been an increase in inequality. I mean, you are not the only ones to say this. No. We have many books have been written about this. French economist, what's his name now?
Thomas Piketty.
Piketty wrote this famous book about exactly this phenomenon, and also Wilkinson and Pickett, other people have written about this. And you say that it's a surprising fact that inequality is increasing despite democracy, if I understand it correctly. So why is that surprising?
Well, I mean, from a very theoretical point of view, you would kind of have expected that people, if the majority are not benefited by the economic policies, for example, that are in place, they would choose politicians that would pursue a different policy that would benefit them, which would ultimately probably lead to more equality. But that's just, I mean, what governs or determines people's voting behavior is obviously a very complex thing, and I don't think we have much to contribute to the explanation compared to Piketty, for example, to the explanation of inequality. I mean, it seems as if we don't get a war or some natural disaster or whatever, then the natural way for things to develop is to have more inequality. That seems to be the case. And what happened during the 20th century is that we had these great shocks. I mean, we had the Depression, and we had the First World War and the Second World War. And that changed the picture in a way that led to more equality during some time. But now we haven't had.
But that was more like an anomaly.
Yeah, an anomaly. Yeah, exactly. And there are obviously economists who are studying these things, and I think it's important to stress that we voters we don't always vote in accordance with our self-interest.
No.
I mean, we are motivated by all sorts of considerations, and today I get the feeling that we are very much motivated by these very simple issues where national governments still have a say. I mean, should you use hijab in school or whatever? I mean, these issues that...
Cultural, social issues.
Yeah, cultural, social, symbolic issues. Whereas these more problematic ones, I mean, how to organize a better healthcare system and so on, or a better tax system, they are much more complicated, and so people don't really know what conclusions to draw from them as far as their voting is concerned. So.
Yeah, but then you're talking about economic inequality, basically,
yes.
here. Yeah, so because if you look at other kinds of inequalities, they have diminished as far as I understand. I mean, if you look at the trends when it comes to the view on homosexuality or, immigrants, people from other countries, racial issues, all these kinds of issues have developed towards more equality or more coherence, as far as I understand.
Yeah,
when I look at the numbers, anyway, even in the United States, actually, where they say it's so polarized.
I mean, again, I think the situation is complex, and these things are also difficult to study, because what people say in response to, when they are asked by somebody might not really represent what they think and so on. But I agree with you that a lot of these studies indicate that in the long term development is that people tend towards these shall we say, I mean, they tend to be more acceptable towards immigrants, for example, and people with different sexual dispositions and so on and so forth. So if you look at it long term, but you can also see some smaller fluctuations in recent years. After 2015, I think there are some in Sweden when we had a big influx of asylum seekers. Some people are less positively disposed to that.
Yeah, I've seen that curve, those figures as well. But it seems could be a hump. Just
I mean,
you never know. Was that after the big influx in 1993 of Bosnian immigrants?
Yeah.
We had this peak of negativity towards immigration in Sweden, and then it went back to a level that was lower than before. Actually. I mean, the negativity level.
Yeah.
And also talking about economic inequality, I think maybe this is just a theory, but maybe people aren't it's not that important for them. It's not as important for them as it is for many decision makers. I'm just theorizing here, because of course a large part of the inequality increase that we've seen is due to the top 1% or the top 0.1% having increased their wealth enormously, whereas the lower portions of the population haven't actually gone. I mean, they haven't become poorer. They have also become a little bit richer, not as much as the other ones. So I mean, the inequality is at the top end, so to speak. It's not at the bottom end. So it might have been a different story if people at the bottom end would have fallen drastically down into poverty.
Yeah, and if we look at the global situation, of course, we have gotten an extreme increase in wealth for the poorest people. So the last few decades, which is a fantastic thing that we should celebrate, of course. But I think why is an inequality a problem? And I don't think that only left-wing economists and politicians think so. I think there's a growing understanding also among right-wing economists and politicians that this is going to be a problem in terms of the social costs and increased polarization and conflict level of society.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so it's not only a matter, I think, of the shall we say, just the material living conditions that you have. A lot of people in Sweden have access to car and computers and all sorts of things. It's also a matter of a sense of unfairness, or I mean that 1% of the world's population controls more than, I don't know, the 30% poorest in the world or whatever. It's a sense that this is undermines esteem to some extent. I mean, social esteem, that people are feeling that, why should I be in this worse situation than these people and so on. And it threatens, therefore, the social cohesion of society, and that we can see distinct groups which do not really share life conditions anymore in the same sense as, let's say, in the 70s or in the 80s. I mean, look at Trump now, who just got out of a hospital, and he got, probably the best medicine anyone has ever received for this COVID-19 disease, which is understandable, of course. He's a head of state, and of course Americans want the government to work. But still, compare that to all the Americans who do not have access to health care of this kind and who are succumbing to this disease.
Sure, absolutely.
And that doesn't confirm a picture of society which is kind of which is devoted to assigning weight to everybody's interests.
Yeah, that's true. But everything is relative, of course, and you could just as well say that this is. What's happening now is that because everyone is informed about everything that's happening all the time, everywhere, all over the world, which means that we are seeing the inequalities now in a way that we didn't do before. And it's obvious to us, which it wasn't. Because, I mean, if you can of course say that the difference between a peasant in the 19th century, a peasant's possibility of getting good health care 1859 compared to the President of the United States, 1859 was probably a lot greater than the difference between a farmer in the United States today getting health care for COVID-19 and the President. If you see what I mean, the difference is probably a lot smaller, but we see it now. We see it so clearly because it's in the news 24/7, and no one can escape it. So
there is also a very robust result from happiness research. It's a silly name, but people, psychologists, sociologists are studying how satisfied people feel with their lives, basically, and that has been going on since the 50s, and there's a lots of data about that. I mean, the reliability of that data can, of course, be questioned because this is a methodologically difficult area. But what it seems to point to is that it doesn't matter to us what we have in absolute terms. What matters is how much we have relative to others, the ones we compare us with, our peers. And if we have some salary and some other guy who's I look upon as my equal has twice that salary, that's going to hurt me more than and that also partly ties into what you just said, because now we are very familiar with these differences that exist through social media and media in general and so on. So that is probably affecting a lot of people. This relative.
That's fascinating. Actually, I've heard about that kind of studies as well. So, but still, going back to the we and the they. I mean, aren't people today more educated and more informed than ever? And that begs the question: who is the elite and who is not the elite, as we were talking about before? And if politicians are, you're talking about this, the democracy, the principles of democracy that citizens should be allowed to vote for people who should be then get the task of governing a country or an area or some place. So why are politicians better suited to govern than others? I mean, is their judgment better, or what is a politician? Shouldn't everyone be able to be a politician? I mean, we're talking about the elite there, because that could really be defined as an elite. The professional politicians who are sometimes even born into the life of being a politician, as opposed to all the others that haven't got the chance to get into that kind of realm. But who might be just as educated, just as informed, just as wise, just as judgmental as these people. So, I mean, why should they govern the country and not me and you and whoever?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think everybody should be open to taking on that responsibility. I mean, to stand for some office and so on. And I want to stress that when we use the term elite, it's not. I mean, it's a neutral term for us. We are not indicating that whoever could be called the elite is, in fact, better educated or has a better ability to make decisions and so on. But
so it's just more an observation of what's
going on in society. But I would say that, and I agree with you also that people are not more stupid today than before, and they are probably more well educated than if we go back a bit. When people, there's an exaggeration of something has gone wrong here with the people don't believe in climate change and so on and so forth, and that's to do with the fact that they don't listen to science any longer. I think that's an argument that can be overstated, and it's not completely the right way to look upon this. But as for politicians, this is the idea. They are not better educated when they get into office or when they choose that career than others, but through taking part of this decision making. They are making it their job to access more information, to reflect more upon these issues, to search for information and so on, in a way that the rest of us don't have time to do because we have other jobs to to tend to. And so there is a learning process, and that has also been confirmed by a study which we are also citing, which is done by a Swedish economist, Folke Tersman, at Stockholm University, where he and his team has simply compared politicians at all levels, even the most local levels, with the general population. And they are, in general, more knowledgeable about the types of issues they are making decisions about, not because they are more clever or anything, but rather because they have, and this is my interpretation, gone through this learning process. They have been involved in politics. They have learned.
So maybe we should have kind of a rotating system then, where everyone has a duty to at some point make decisions over at least the local community.
I mean, we are considering that idea to some extent in our book, and of course in Athens, where democracy
first democracy.
started. I mean, some offices were distributed through lotteries. So that is somewhat congenial with the democratic idea. We don't think that is a good idea, though. We think that political parties are a good thing, because where people work, because they don't only make decisions, they also function as think tanks. So they come up with new proposals, they come up with new ideas, and so on. And these ideas are then tested in the public discussion and in the discussion in parliament and in other bodies. And we need these impulses. We need a plurality of ideas, basically. And they are developed in political parties.
So what about the Swiss type model, where there are a lot of referendums?
Yeah, no, we don't like that. I mean, we like a type of democracy where there is a responsiveness to the people's opinions on issues. I mean, politicians should represent our, not being a Stockholmer or those parts of our identity, but they should represent our views. But we don't believe that referendums are.
Switzerland seems to be a pretty well-off country, though, and people are satisfied.
Of course, and maybe different systems could be used in different settings depending on cultural differences. But referendums, I mean, they are very. As the Brexit one, for example, illustrated, they are very sensitive to, for example, how you define the alternatives and all sorts of things that make them vulnerable to manipulation and problems like that.
I guess the Swiss, I'm just guessing here, but I guess that the Swiss are more used to them, so they're not as prone to being manipulated as
probably not
as the British, because they don't have that many anyway. So, well, you like parties and you like the party system. So, what I think I'm seeing here, and not only me but many, is that these classical, I was mentioning this before, the classical traditional left-wing scale parties seem to be on their way out, or at least they're diminishing. They're having some problems establishing themselves right now. Do you think that, and we are seeing other parties then, of course, we are seeing these left-wing, right-wing populist parties, we're seeing other kinds of movements. Actually, that's important. We see a lot of movements going on, not least among young people. We see all these protests in the streets in many countries around the world, and we see climate protests and Black Lives Matter movements, protests in the United States, and also across the globe, because everything is globalized now. Even ideas are globalized. So do you think that these classical, traditional 19th century products, parties like the Conservative Party, the Social Democratic Party, the Liberal Party, the somewhat newer Green Party, that kind of system is on its way out, and there is something else coming? Or do you think that they will rebound?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I wish I had a crystal ball. But let me. So I think I being as old as I am, I think I'm less good at actually making these predictions as those who are younger and are more involved in these types of alternative organizations. But what is noteworthy is that membership numbers are going down and have been going down for a very long time, and I think a lot of the organizations and contexts in which democracy was carried out before, when I was young in the 70s and 80s, they are kind of withering away. I mean, I'm involved in some such contexts, and it's harder and harder to get people to get involved and to stand for some type of or take on some type of task and so on. I think the difficulties with the traditional party system is exactly what we started out with. That it's very hard for a political party. Take the Green Party in Sweden, for example, to pursue a coherent agenda when they have to rely on support from extremely different types of other parties, basically, and that makes
conflicting ideologies.
Yeah. I mean, we can see that, and also because what the national government decides upon may not come out to be true because decisions are made elsewhere, which kind of counteract what we are trying to achieve. I mean, climate change is obviously a good example. What we do here in Sweden, if we only look at the things we have control of, that's not going to change much.
No.
But the same holds for almost every country.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that globalization of democracy.
Of course, but let me just finish. I mean, and then we have seen the rise of other types of organizations, NGOs, for example, and they are working differently. I think they are working towards getting a more global type of influence, for example, by taking part in UN processes and being active in now. They are revising the UN Charter and system and that sort of thing. So they are working differently. I guess that's a new movement in society that is probably going to last a bit. And that might have
but maybe it's a natural thing that it's evolving that way. I mean, the parties, they were created in the late 19th century, early 20th century. It's not God-given that they have to exist forever. So maybe we, as you're talking a lot about in the book, the fight against climate change, maybe that should take place within another kind of movement, which is globalized in a way.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking of, these initiatives where, say, regions of different countries join together the biggest cities of the world perhaps can form an alliance and they promise each other to do things with emissions, for example. And that's a new type of political structure, which is multinational, and which is also very exciting.
I think it's very simple. I love that kind of idea. And I'm going to talk to other people also about this nation-state thing. If it's, I mean, I don't think nation-states are God-given either. So I mean, at some point we will see something else. And borders have always changed. We forget that, but they kind of fluctuate.
And what's important for us, of course, is that democracy must survive in this new environment.
Exactly. So that's why we have to talk about the your last chapter. Which is about globalizing democracy. And you are talking about, you're discussing world government, but you're not completely in agreement, you and your co-writer, about this thing of world government. I think Torbjörn Tännsjö is more into that. You're a bit skeptical towards that. But you both want to see some kind of, you're talking about the second chamber in the United Nations, maybe, where every country is represented, and that they're going to decide on laws that have to be followed, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, we're in agreement that we need stronger supranational institutions, We need to. The UN is a great thing, I think, but it's much too weak to help us solve this. So we need to strengthen that system towards. We talk about world government, world global democracy, and so on, and people tend to stop listening when we say that. But I don't think you need to really take that in one big leap. I think you should see it as a gradual process, and it has already started right after the Second World War. We got international institutions. The International Crimes Tribunal, for example, and others. And it's a gradual thing, but we need to speed up that process. So, as you said, the chamber. We are talking about a parliamentary assembly, which should be established at the side of the General Assembly. So we are not saying that take that away. We want to create another assembly where people should. Representatives should be elected, and in this parliamentary assembly, we are thinking, in the beginning, it should be purely advisory, not something that can make decisions at this point, because that's going to be too hard to make acceptable to anyone. But if it's purely advisory, it should be easier to get command support from it, and there is a.
But what's the difference between that and the General Assembly that exists today?
Simply that people will be elected democratically.
Okay.
Yeah, in a representative.
Yeah,
way.
that's a big difference. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big. And because we are thinking like the national parliaments, in the beginning they didn't have much to say. The king did as he or the queen did as she wanted, but over time. It was the only body that could give decisions a kind of clear legitimacy in the eye of the population. So it's very tempting for someone who has a political will to go to this assembly and ask them and to get their support.
Yeah.
And once it has that role, it's very easy to see how it can
eventually
acquire
get
more
power.
More power.
So it starts off as a kind of a lobby organization, and then
or a forum for discussion. Yeah, a forum for.
Do you see do you liken this with what has been going on in the European Union, and do you see the European Parliament as a kind of role model for this kind of body?
Yeah. People tend to say that the EU is a big catastrophe and it's a big disappointment, and that's true to some extent. Of course, we have all these problems with. Now, for example,
well, it depends on what you expect.
Yeah, exactly, and we'd say the response to Belarus. That's a good example, but people more seldom talk about what the EU has achieved. And is achieving, and I think it's we should see it as an experiment. It started out as a pretty weak thing, as a club, we might say, which countries could join, and then they could discuss and then say, we are going to agree on this, and those types of discussions actually led to changes in policy, and that has been going on now. We have a parliament, more power has been transferred towards the parliament, which I think is a good thing. And the EU works well in certain respects. So I see EU as a positive thing in today's.
So what you're envisaging is more or less a global organization like the European Union.
Yeah,
eventually,
exactly. Without its
maybe
flaws.
not without the Commission and.
Yeah. We are talking about these piecemeal steps. So a parliamentary assembly would be one thing. Yeah. We think there should be an international environmental tribunal next to the International Crimes Tribunal, for example, which could be facilitate and monitor agreements such as the Paris Agreement and fine or in some way punish people who are violating the agreement and so on. We could look at sectors. We could take the situation in the seas in the world and the fact that fisheries are depleted, and we could have a stronger institution which would focus on that. and perhaps partition the sea in zones, and the ways we do it in more local contexts. So we are looking at piecemeal steps, but I see EU as a positive thing in today's.
You mentioned punishing. What about the enforcing these?
Enforcing
the new global laws that you're envisaging. How would they be enforced?
Yeah, I mean, so of course, in the science fiction version of this, we have a kind of a global police force or a global military force, but that's going to take a while, I think. But
maybe coordination between the nations, states, different armies or police forces.
Yeah,
in the European Union.
Exactly, and some types of punishments are softer. So, for example, if there is a collaboration of some sort and you have some advantages of being a part of it, then not being allowed to be a part of it is a type of punishment. So that's another incentive. That could be another incentive. I mean, contrasted to invasion, another type of incentive that could affect policy in a very, I think, decisive way.
Okay, there is one big nation that is at the center of many of these discussions, and ever more so it's China, of course. And there has been a lot of discussion about what's happening there, and 10, 15 years ago there was I wouldn't say that there was an agreement that China was going towards relentlessly towards democracy, but many thought so, me included, I think. And to my and many others' surprise, it hasn't really done that. Or in some respects, it actually has, because people tend to we focus on the problems a lot in this society, in this world, and we tend not to see what's actually happening in other respects. I mean, as far as I understand, the Chinese have never been as free as they are today, because that country has never been a democracy, has never been free. The Chinese have never been free. There was the emperor, and then there was the communist China, and then it's still called the Communist Party, which it's capitalist, but it's called the Communist Party, so it's an authoritarian capitalist state. And they're not free, but they're a little bit freer when it comes to, I mean, I understand they can protest against environmental problems, for instance. They can protest against corruption to some extent, or at least they used to be able to some years ago. And the authorities kind of change according to what people are saying, and they can travel. Many of them can travel anyway, and they can start businesses. And so, I mean, in some respects, the Chinese have never been as free as they are today. But then, of course, we look at it with the eyes of a Westerner and see that it's not. They can't start parties, and they can't vote for another party than the Communist Party. So, what I want to ask is how likely it is that this authoritarian state, capitalist China, called communist, has actually found a regime model which the Chinese are willing to acquiesce to for the foreseeable future, or how likely is the opposite thing, that there is actually some kind of political awakening in China that is closer than is obvious today.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, I don't have much to contribute with that. I don't know enough about China and what's going on there and what's going to happen. So I don't think my predictions are going to be very good. But
you can guess like everybody else does.
Like everybody else. But well, what we are thinking, I mean, it's obviously for those who, like us, are in favor of democracy, China is a big problem. But, when we are advocating global democracy, a big one of the main arguments for that is that we need coordination at a global level to survive as a civilization. Climate change, for example, and other types of global challenges. No country is going to be able to escape the bad consequences of the bad effects of these things. And no country is going to be able to fix this by itself. They have to do it in collaboration with others. And I think that is going to put a pressure on countries like China eventually. Not now, perhaps, and I don't think we should just look at the present situation, because it doesn't look good if you look at even Russia or the United States as well. But eventually, I think that when the consequences are more dire than today from climate change, for example, there will be pressure towards more collaboration, and that, I think, would promote a more democratic development in China as well.
Okay, so you mean that when the government of China, when the leaders in China, the authorities in China are forced to collaborate more with other countries, then even the population, the ordinary citizens of China will take advantage of that, or there will be an opening for them to...
I think that might be the case.
How does that work, really? Yeah. How does it work, really?
Well, there's an I mean, for example, we could put pressure on China and say, you need to respect this.
In order for you to collaborate with us, you have to. Okay,
and those types of things, and also an understanding among the Chinese population, I would guess, that we need to. We might have to revise this system that is in place today. But, this is just the crystal ball again. I don't know. I'm hoping. I'm an optimistically inclined person, so I'm hoping that we will make it. And I think there is a pressure towards democratization in the long run.
Let's hope for that. Talking about optimism and philosophy, you are, after all, a philosopher. One question, because when I read your book, I got this impression that it's a super interesting, very, very recommendable book, absolutely. But it's it displays kind of a mechanistic view on human beings. Actually, you might say, perhaps not cynical, but a bit technical and mechanistic. Like people, citizens are machines that have. Need rules in order to operate, and I mean, this is, I don't know exactly how I'm going to formulate this question, but it's like, do you think that humankind is actually going through some kind of evolution? I think so myself, namely, that's why I'm asking, and that people are actually becoming more and more aware of what we are doing and what we're not doing, and what we're doing to our planet and what we're doing to each other, and that love and compassion, if you want to use those words, are becoming more and more real things for people that they're not afraid of using and contemplating, which would entail that maybe in some future, ordinary people, the majority of people, won't need as many strict technical, mechanical rules about what's going to happen in society, because everyone understands that we have to treat each other with respect and love, if you see what I mean. So that would entail some kind of evolution, which means that all this talk about democracy and parties and the system that has to work in order for us to not fall down into some kind of chaos wouldn't be as needed.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that when you sent me this email about this interview. I saw that point which you wrote, and I think that's a very interesting point you're raising now. I mean, highly interesting. And
maybe that's the subject of another podcast.
No, but let me say a few things. I mean, I think the hard disk of humans is not going to change, I guess. I mean, it developed. We have been around for quite a short time. I think it hasn't changed much the last 10,000 years or so, or even 100,000 years. I don't know. So that's not going to change. But given the ways humans are, I mean, the human intellect is designed, we are extremely flexible, I think, and we can change, adapt very quickly, and we seldom have a correct understanding of how flexible we are. So you could look at that in retrospect. I mean, let's take a trivial example. I mean, in Sweden, we introduced this ban towards smoking in restaurants and so on, and people said, that's not going to work, and blah blah blah. And the day after, people just adapted like this, and I think we have that ability. If if sufficiently much is at stake. I mean, take the U.S. economy during the Second World War. Everything was changed so that in a way that would facilitate victory over Nazi Germany. I mean, in a few years, and everybody participated. That's something like that we need, I think, for fighting climate change. And I think that there's room for that in human psychology. And I think I'm a little bit, and maybe that's what you picked up in the book. I and we are probably a little bit also locked into our own, experience and history, and about, for example, when we discuss about the drivers of people, and that can surely change, I think. It's just that we lack the imagination to see all these changes that are possible.
Yeah. There's a tendency to extrapolate
what's from your particular circumstances. And I like very much, was it Martin Luther King who said that the history of human civilization is a long curve, but it bends towards the good. And I think that is, I like that metaphor. And if you look at lots and lots of figures in the world right now, I mean, we see a decrease of violence. We see a decrease of homicides, I mean, over the last 20, 30 years. And I think compassion and empathy has gone up very much. So I am
you're on Steven Pinker's side.
I am. Yes.
Yeah, me too, actually. I think it's the bending curve you were talking about. I'm talking about sometimes a curve going up, and it's a wave, but it's inclined upwards. So every new trough is a little bit more shallow than the former one. Previous one. But we often tend to focus on the setbacks, especially if you read the news. Yeah,
and if I could say one negative side, unfortunately, I don't think time is on our side.
Okay.
So we are hoping that will happen before climate change makes life unbearable enough.
And that's a discussion for several other podcasts.
Okay.
Okay. Folke Tersman, thank you so much for being a guest on the show, and good luck with your book here now.
And thank you for all your questions.